All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for CCUS Demystified, CCUS 101, Capture to Containment. This is the first part of a four-part series that we're planning, looking at CCUS, kind of the basics of CCUS, and then we'll do more deeper dives into transport, storage, as well as kind of a state example case study, if you will. My name is Alex Krauka. I'm a deputy program director with the U.S. Energy Association. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with USEA, USEA was founded in 1924, so just over 100 years old. We're a nonprofit, non-lobbying educational association that represents kind of the full gamut of the energy industry, from fossils to renewables, nuclear, everything in between. Represent the broad interests of the industry by increasing the understanding of energy issues both domestically and internationally. USEA has had projects on pretty much every continent except for Antarctica and Australia. We serve as a resource by convening energy stakeholders to share policy, scientific, and technological information to foster the advancement of the entire energy sector. The reason we're hosting a CCUS program or CCUS webinar, that is due to our consensus program, which works to build both a domestic and international consensus on the needs for and uses of various clean fossil energy technologies. So things like CCUS, clean coal technologies, hydrogen with CCUS, and a few others. This program operates by convening briefings, webinars, workshops. We will produce research reports and white papers and short technology and policy briefs. And then we also have a bi-monthly newsletter to help keep our stakeholders informed. Just a couple quick logistics note. As everyone is aware, we are hosting this on Zoom. This webinar is being recorded, and we will post it on YouTube as well as our event page, hopefully within the next 24 hours, but by the end of the week at the latest. We will hold Q&A until after all the presentations, and we ask that you use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom windows for any questions and comments that you may have. And if you are attending this webinar and would like to receive any sort of continuing education credit or professional development credit, and you need a certification that you attended this webinar, please feel free to reach out to me at akrauka@usea.org. Just a quick little setting of the stage, a few basic terms to know. We'll go in more detail here shortly, but CCUS, also known as carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, or carbon capture, use, and storage, more colloquially, is essentially capturing CO2 emissions from power generation and industrial sources, and then either using that CO2 or storing it underground. Geologic storage is the permanent storage of CO2 in deep underground formations. You might hear the term Class 6 well in the context of geologic storage. This is a EPA designation specifically for geologic CO2 storage, for injection wells used for geologic CO2 storage. Enhanced oil recovery, a technique where CO2 is injected into depleted oil fields to extract additional oil. And then sometimes in the context of CCUS, you'll hear direct air capture. This is essentially a technology that removes CO2 directly from the air. We've got a great list of speakers here today. Dr. Josh Scheidele from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Christian Flynn from the Carbon Capture Coalition, and Kevin Connors from University of North Dakota's Energy and Environmental Research Center will be our presenters today. I won't go through their bios in the interest of time. However, I do suggest you can access their bios on our event page. And then to moderate our Q&A, we have Dr. Emmanuel Taylor, who's an independent consultant, a former colleague of mine from over a decade ago, who's a great facilitator and moderator. So happy to have him on the line here to to moderate our Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm going to stop taking any more time than I need to, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Kevin Connors from the University of North Dakota's Energy and Environmental Research Center. Kevin, you're sharing your screen, confirming that I can see your presentation. So with that, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much. As was mentioned, my name is Kevin Connors. I'm the Assistant Director for Regulatory Compliance and Energy Policy at the University of North Dakota's Energy and Environmental Research Center, or the EERC. And I'll be get the great privilege to be presenting on carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS 101. Before I get started here, just want to introduce the EERC. We have a long history that dates back into the 1950s. We're located in Grand Forks, North Dakota, as you can see in the map there in the bottom right corner. We're a business unit of the University of North Dakota. We're focused on energy and environmental solutions, and you can see our facility. It's a little over 250,000 square foot facility with state-of-the-art laboratories and demonstration facilities, and then also office space. We have about 250 employees at the ERC. And we really focus on innovation of technologies or marketable products, and we work closely with industry to do so. Everything from the kind of the early pioneering stage of a new technology or marketable product through laboratory or technology demonstration into commercial demonstration all the way to commercialization. We shepherd those technologies or marketable products kind of through that innovation process. The ERC has been working in CCS and CCUS for over 20 years, and that's what I'll focus the rest of my presentation on. We have a long-standing research and development program at the ERC that we manage called the P Corps Partnership. Today I manage the P Corps Partnership. We've been performing applied research in CCUS for over 20 years. We started out characterizing our region. You can see the North America is really today there's 4 regional partnerships that are looking at advancing CCUS across their respective regions, and the ERC manages the Northern Great Plains, Northwestern region of North America. It's the P Corps Partnership region. It's a 10-state, 4 Canadian province region. And we started out really just characterizing the region, trying to answer the question, is CCUS a viable option in this region of North America? We quickly got to the answer yes, and we began characterizing the subsurface, the geology, and identifying the ideal rock formations for large-scale CO2 storage. That led to pilot testing and field demonstration where we partnered with industry to do some small-scale injection. And then we had a commercial demonstration phase where we worked with an industry partner to demonstrate 1 million tons of CO2 injected and permanently stored within a 12-month time period, and we were very successful there. And today we're focused on commercializing this set of technologies. Just want to maybe step back and talk about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a commodity. That's the position that we've taken in terms of advancing this set of technologies, and carbon dioxide certainly has a use specifically in the oil and gas industry. And Alex mentioned that in his intro through using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. So one of the objectives is to connect the industrial facilities that CO2 is a source, and using carbon capture technology to capture that CO2 and find economic uses for that CO2 specifically in the oil and gas industry and in oil and gas fields. The oil and gas industry has been using carbon dioxide for over 50 years. And today it's occurring, CO2 enhanced oil recovery is occurring in 10 US states. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. Some key terminology that we're going to be using: the dedicated storage. We're talking about injecting CO2 into a rock formation that is non-oil and gas bearing. In other words, it's high saline or saltwater formation, and the primary purpose is permanent storage. When we talk about associated storage, we're talking about injecting CO2 into an oil-bearing reservoir, typically a depleted oil reservoir, to improve or enhance that oil recovery, so you're able to use that CO2 as a working fluid to produce more oil. And the CO2 is stored in association with that activity, and it's permanently stored in the reservoir. And I'll talk a little bit more about that process. We have the 45Q tax credit, which today is a driver. It's an incentive for the industry to capture CO2. And the federal tax credit today is at $85 a ton for point source capture for both dedicated storage and associated storage. There's also a tax credit for direct air capture, but I'll be focused on CCUS today. Pore space, that's when we talk about in terms of the geology, the tiny spaces in the rock grains of a geologic formation. It's going to be occupied by fluid. When we talk about porosity and permeability, that's the terms we use to describe the quality of the rock reservoir. And then I'll talk a little bit about cap rock. These are layers of rocks that are impermeable that sit above and below your storage reservoir or the formation that you're looking to inject CO2 into, and your cap rocks are acting as a containment for that injection activity. Cap rocks are going to be naturally occurring if you have an oil and gas reservoir. They're trapping that oil and gas in place, and that's why the oil is there. So again, that's one of the reasons that we're able to inject CO2 into oil reservoirs to enhance oil recoveries, because there's that cap rock containment in addition to your storage reservoir, which is your underground geologic formation. It's not going to be a drinking water source, and it has the right properties to inject carbon dioxide into. We typically call that the injection zone, and we call the cap rock the confining zone. So a couple different interchangeable terms there. When we talk about carbon capture and storage, we're talking about capturing carbon dioxide off of an industrial facility, compressing that carbon dioxide and preparing it for transportation and injection, and then transporting that CO2 to an injection well. Alex mentioned it in his intro. So a dedicated storage injection well is a Class 6 injection well. It's been classified by the EPA for large volume CO2 injection for the primary purpose of geologic storage. So in a non-oil bearing reservoir, that's a Class 6 well. We also inject CO2 through a Class 2 well. That would be for injection for the purposes of enhanced oil recovery. And that's where we get carbon capture utilization and storage, or the U in CCUS is for utilizing that CO2 to recover more oil. So two different types of injection wells, both are regulated in a manner that protects underground sources of drinking water and protects the environment. When we talk about enhanced oil recovery, again, capturing CO2 from an industrial source or CO2 that's naturally occurring in the subsurface has also been used since the 1970s to recover oil. So that CO2 is either captured or extracted from a reservoir, transported to the oil fields, injected into a depleted oil reservoir. That CO2 then brings pressure back to the reservoir. The CO2, when it comes in contact with the existing oil in place, causes that oil to swell. It changes the viscosity of the oil and allows that oil to flow from where it was previously trapped in those rock pores. The CO2 will replace it. Oil then becomes mobile and is able to be produced via a production well. So again, you're able to use CO2. It's in the oil industry, it's called a working fluid, and you're able to have that CO2 help produce oil that would not otherwise be produced without it. So there's great benefits to utilizing carbon dioxide to improve oil recovery. And then we also have looked at the life cycle analysis of oil that's been recovered using carbon dioxide, and it's marketable in the sense that it has a lower carbon intensity because we're using CO2 to recover that oil from the reservoir. When the oil is produced, it's also produced with CO2. They're separated at surface. The oil goes to market, and the CO2 actually gets recycled back into the reservoir and injected. So you're permanently storing that CO2 as you're using it to recover more oil. I know this is a little bit of a busy slide, but I just want to touch on just the different approaches to capturing CO2 and really just focus on the left-hand side here. So we have post-combustion capture, where you're capturing CO2 from, say, a coal-fired electricity generation or coal-fired power plant or a combined cycle gas processing plant. You'll notice the percentage of CO2 in those streams is a little bit lower. And that's why you have a higher cost to try to remove that or capture that CO2 off of a stream that has other constituents in it. And so as you kind of from bottom to top, you get more expensive costs from capture in this diagram. We also have pre-combustion capture. I have a really good example of this from a gasification process in North Dakota, where that plant is capturing its CO2 prior to combustion of coal. So this is post-combustion, pre-combustion. And then we have industrial processes. I'm going to focus really on ethanol production, where we have examples in the United States of capturing that CO2 really just right off the fermentation process. And you're having a stream that's pretty much 99% CO2. So not as high cost as trying to separate the CO2 from other constituents in terms of the ethanol production process. And that's why you're seeing ethanol facilities really advancing CCS today, and they're able to market their ethanol product as a low carbon intensity product in doing so. So just want to give you some real examples here. We have a post-combustion capture facility in southern Saskatchewan. It's the Boundary Dam project. That's been capturing CO2 since 2014. They capture about 1 million metric tons of CO2 on an annual basis. It's a 110 megawatt plant. And that CO2 is being captured, compressed, and then transported to the oil fields in southern Saskatchewan for enhanced oil recovery. And there's also a dedicated storage well not too far from this facility where sometimes that CO2 is also going to be stored in permanent storage geologically. Another example is we have the Petra Nova plant. It's in Thompsons, Texas, and just outside of Houston. And that's a 240 megawatt electricity generation facility. And they're capturing about 2 million tons of CO2 per year, and they're transporting that CO2 to oil fields in Texas for enhanced oil recovery. This is the Synfuels plant that I was referring to in North Dakota. It's the Dakota gasification plant. They've been capturing CO2 off their pre-combustion gasification process since 2000. You can see in the bottom left corner of the screen, there's a 205-mile pipeline that transports that CO2 to southern Saskatchewan. And to date, they've transported over 40 million metric tons to the oil fields in southern Saskatchewan for enhanced oil recovery. And they've also have just north of the facility here a dedicated storage project that's taking about a little over 2 million tons a year and storing that CO2 just north of this facility here in a dedicated storage project. And my last example is an ethanol plant in North Dakota. There's several ethanol plants in the country that are capturing their CO2 and storing it. So this is just one example. This is in Richardton, North Dakota. It's owned and operated by Gevo. And they're capturing about 180,000 metric tons of CO2 per year. And the capture facility is then compresses that CO2. Actually, there's just a really short pipeline to an injection well, and they're storing that CO2 actually within the bounds of their lands here. And they're able to market their ethanol product as a low carbon intensity product, as I mentioned. So we've talked about capture, let's talk about transport. There's over 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines in the United States. As I mentioned, there's both industrial sources and naturally occurring sources that you have in Colorado. And then we have an example. The CO2 has been being transported safely in the United States really since the 1970s. I'll talk a little bit more about a few different examples when I kind of hone in on the Great Plains region. And we haven't had any fatalities in terms of if there's been a CO2 pipeline failure, there's been no fatalities associated with those failures. And when you really start to look at the statistics, CO2 pipelines have a phenomenal track record for safety. I'm going to talk a little bit now about geology. I'm going to kind of go into the region of the country where I'm most familiar with in the northern Great Plains. And I kind of want to zoom in and talk about these different sedimentary basins. These would be the locations that we target for CO2 storage, both dedicated and associated with enhanced oil recovery. And we have activities today that I'm going to be talking about further in my presentation. But as we zoom in to the Williston Basin in North Dakota, it actually expands into southern Saskatchewan, and then also Montana and South Dakota. And I just want to point out the red line here. So I'm going to just show a cross section of this sedimentary basin, kind of the North Dakota cross section of it. And you can see here these sedimentary basins are layered with sedimentary rock formations. This is a really great example of how we characterize the geology and look to safely inject and permanently store CO2. We start from the top down and we look at our underground sources of drinking water. We want to make sure we're protecting those. And then we have a series of rock formations that are impermeable shales, followed by rocks that have good porosity and permeability. Sandstones are good examples of that. So we have different formations that we use to dispose of wastewater. We have formations that we target for CO2 storage. And then below that, we also in Williston Basin have oil and gas producing formations that are really ideal and suitable for enhanced oil recovery today using CO2. So some of the characteristics that we look for is we look for depth. So I mentioned when we talk about capture, we're capturing that CO2, you're compressing the CO2 because when you have it in a gaseous phase, it's a large molecule. CO2 is the type of molecule that when you compress it under temperature and pressure, you actually can really reduce down the size of it. We call it dense phased or supercritical CO2, where it actually acts more like a fluid. And when we keep it under temperature and pressure, then we're able to more efficiently transport that CO2 and inject it and efficiently able to handle large volumes of CO2 when it's under temperature and pressure and it's in that dense phase. So when we look at the subsurface, we want to be under a certain depth because as you go into the depths of the earth, you increase in temperature and pressure. So under 2,600 foot depth is really what we look for to be able to maintain that dense phase supercritical CO2. We look for rocks that have good porosity and permeability to inject that CO2, but that also have those impermeable formations above and below that we call cap rock or containment formations. Again, we're looking at formations that aren't drinking water sources, so they have really low quality salt water in them, or they're oil and gas producing formations. And then we also evaluate in and around the project area for leakage pathways. We look for faults or fractures, and we also look for wells that have been drilled in the past maybe that have been exploratory wells in the oil and gas industry to make sure that there's no leakage pathways where the injected CO2 could then leak out of the reservoir and go up into our underground sources of drinking water. Just really simple example of porosity and permeability. The jar of marbles has both porosity and permeability. That's the pore spaces between the different marbles, and then the network that connects those pores. So that's porosity and permeability. The globe on the other side of the screen has porosity but no permeability. In other words, there's no network connecting the pores. And so here's a perfect example of a sandstone rock that we're injecting CO2 into today in North Dakota. It has really great porosity and permeability, although you can't see it by just the human eye. If you were to take a water dropper and just drop water, little droplets of water on this, it would absorb it right away. It's like a sponge. And we're able to inject large volumes of CO2 into this rock. And it sits about over a mile deep into the earth. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the rest of my presentation will be on safety and then a little bit of the activities that are occurring in our region. We really focus on protecting the environment when we develop these projects and specifically as the injection wells are designed. And so the first way when we drill a well to construct it, we make sure that the fresh water is protected as we're drilling through it. And then we construct the well with steel casing and cement across those water zones, and then we drill through the rest of we drill through the bottom of that well to then go further into to target our injection horizon or our storage reservoir, and then we construct that well with steel casing and cement. So I'll give you just an example here. So this is an actual injection well design, again made to protect the environment. So we install steel casing and we cement that to surface, and then we drill through and we install another string of steel casing and cement that to surface. And then we actually, when CO2 is injected, there's an additional string of steel tubing and an isolation packer, and the bottom of the well in the storage reservoir is perforated. And so when you inject CO2, the only thing the CO2 comes in contact with is the steel tubing, and then the CO2 is pushed out into the formation. You have your confining layers above and below, and this is a technology that's been in use for over 100 years in terms of these well designs. We have a very good track record of being able to inject fluids, in this case CO2, ensure that that well maintains integrity with the multiple layers of protection. So these wells are engineered and designed with the geology in mind and also to protect the environment. CO2 is monitored every step of the way from the moment it is captured and compressed through transportation and through CO2 pipelines, all the way to the injection well and injected into the subsurface. And we have technologies also today that can image that CO2 once it's injected, and we can track it where it goes into when it's injected into the formation. And lastly, I just want to just give a perspective in the region that I'm from. We have over 40 years of CCUS operations. We have over 1,600 miles of CO2 pipelines without incident that have been operating since 1986. And we have stored safely over 176 million tons of CO2 just in the Northern Great Plains region alone. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. Really appreciate you joining us and taking the time to teach everyone kind of the basics of CCUS. Nearly 50% of our registrants either had never heard of CCUS or just know a little about that. So for those of you in that category, I certainly hope that this was useful and helpful for you, and that you feel a little bit more knowledgeable about the topic right now. Um, Next up, we have Dr. Josh Scheidley from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to discuss various kind of non-EOR CO2 utilization methods. I personally find this a really exciting space within the CCUS field, although I've heard it referred to as kind of the redheaded stepchild of CCUS. But there's some really cool work being done in different pathways for utilizing CO2, whether it's low carbon jet fuels or building materials. I've even heard there's a company or two out there making vodka with CO2. So with that, I'm gonna pass it on to Josh.
Thank you, Alex, for the redheaded stepchild introduction. I like it. It's a good way to kick off the webinar. Yeah, and excited to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, and outstanding to get a chance to follow behind Kevin because he did a great job providing the background, the framework on CCUS. And as Alex highlighted, we wanted to spend a bit more minutes talking about CO2 utilization specifically. And as Kevin noted, the U in CCUS is for utilization. And the crux behind that, and it builds off Kevin's comment about CO2 as a commodity, the crux behind this is we want to create value from CO2. When we think about CO2 utilization, there's really two main paths. There's a path where you can utilize the CO2 directly as it is. And Kevin talked about one of those specifically that's ongoing today in enhanced oil recovery. Another great example is in food and beverage, right? When you pop open a soda can, the carbonation is from CO2, just added as it is in a clean form to your beverage. It's used in many other ways in the food and beverage industry. That is a direct use. There's also a path forward where you chemically transform the CO2, you combine it with other molecules, use it as a precursor to make other products. In this case, you can combine CO2 with ammonia and make fertilizer. You can combine CO2 with hydrogen and make other chemicals and fuels, in this case, making the fuels we use in our everyday life, like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. And so those two core paths are really critical to the way that we think about CO2 utilization. And what I'll note is that there are multiple technologies that exist for CO2 to products, and they have varying advantages and disadvantages. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time and really diving into detail on those different technologies, but happy to take questions or dialogue around that. Part of the reason why there's been so much excitement around CO2 utilization is this potential market size. And so this study on the left highlighted the potential product you can target, from fuels to enhanced oil recovery, construction materials. And what you'll note is there's multiple segments of those markets that can be at, billion tons per year or more scale of CO2 utilized. And when you take those various product streams and you add up all of those markets, with the study on the right from Carbon 180, you end up with over $1 trillion of potential market value. So that's significant and is a reason why there's excitement around utilizing CO2 as a feedstock to go into some of these markets. More recently, the Global CO2 Initiative has taken a closer look at this and added the aspect of time. So on the left, what we're showing here is many of the same products that were highlighted on the last screen, but now on the x-axis, we're highlighting what is the amount of time estimated to get to 10% market penetration. And so what you'll note here is we're not talking about 10% market penetration for most of these products in 5 years. We're talking about 15 to 25 years. And so that's important to take into account that many of these processes are capital intensive, and it takes time to scale up and build out these technologies. Now, the second thing I want to highlight on this graphic is the two at the top, the two products, jet fuel and aggregates. And the reason to highlight these is they're very good examples of the sort of diversity of products you can make from CO2. So if we start with one side on jet fuel, you are targeting a high value product, a fuel. You're taking CO2 and adding energy, adding hydrogen to make a hydrocarbon. But ultimately, that is just combusted and the CO2 goes back into the atmosphere. Now, with aggregates, it's a much lower value stream because you're pretty much just making rocks, right? Aggregate is about 60 to 75% by mass of concrete. And you can react CO2 with various feed streams like mine tailings and others and mineralize that CO2 and then utilize that as the aggregates for concrete. So lower value stream, high volume, but in this case, now the CO2 is actually durably stored for some period of time in that rock, in that concrete that is utilized. And so very unique avenues that sort of show the full range of potential products from CO2. Now, importantly, if we want to touch on that jet fuel piece, there is a brutal reality that we have to face. And that reality is that when you're taking CO2 and trying to produce a fuel, most of the fuels we utilize today are liquid hydrocarbon fuels. So they are made up of predominantly hydrogen and carbon. Now, CO2, you're starting with 72 weight% oxygen. So less than 30 weight% of your feed is carbon, which is that core building block for your hydrocarbon fuels. And of course, your CO2 is neither free nor pure. Secondly, you're starting with a combustion product. When you combust a hydrocarbon, you produce CO2 and water. And so CO2 has no inherent energy content. So in order to take CO2 and make a fuel product, you have to put in a lot of energy in various forms, whether it's heat, electricity, hydrogen, to produce that end product. And then finally, Kevin hit on this already. While we do have some existing pipeline infrastructure, much of it built out for enhanced oil recovery and others being proposed, it's still fairly limited. And so this is an important consideration as we think about how would you build out infrastructure for CO2 utilization in terms of where you site the facilities and how you scale those and how you get the CO2 to those facilities. Now, as we consider CO2 utilization more broadly, the opportunity is this is a domestic feedstock that we can source in the United States, and it can enable expanded production of fuels, chemicals, and materials. Kevin highlighted utilizing ethanol biorefineries as a source of CO2 because of the high quality and high purity byproduct stream of CO2. This report in the top left here did an analysis and showed that if you added a CO2 utilization unit onto an ethanol biorefinery and you took that CO2 and produced more ethanol, you could increase the overall ethanol production from that facility by up to 45%. So that's fairly significant. In addition, recent assessments from the Global CO2 Initiative show that there's a robust pipeline of technologies from technology readiness level 6 and below that are ready to move into this field and ready to support future scale-up. And of course, this avenue of utilizing CO2 supports our carbon-based economy, where so much of the materials and the fuels that we utilize are based on carbon. Now, some of the challenges are many of these technologies that are being developed, they've developed a step, a unit operation, but a limited amount of full integration of the process and have limited work so far on scaling up. There are some examples of commercial processes, but in many cases with these earlier stage technologies, they have limited experience on the scale-up side. We talked about the energy demand, but how you supply the energy when you think about the scale of these facilities is a considerable challenge. We'll talk about cost in a moment, and then matching the scale of the CO2 feed stream with the scale of the CO2 conversion needs and the process needs that you have is also a consideration. So what I want to close by is highlighting one specific example So if we think about producing synthetic aviation fuel from CO2, and I'm just going to use this process up here as an example. It's not meant to support or advocate for any one pathway. It's not the best pathway. It's just saying this is a pathway that we evaluated for producing jet fuel from CO2. And as you can see, this is a multi-step process. And we performed an analysis and a process model around this entire end-to-end approach. And what we wanted to highlight was the impact of the source of the energy and the source of the CO2 on the cost of producing that jet fuel. So in this graph on the y-axis, we're mapping the cost of producing that jet fuel. And all of the color bars on the left side, the yellow, blue, green, purple, are routes to produce synthetic aviation fuel from bio-derived feedstocks. So this is a reference point. And you can see these range from $2 a gallon up to $10 a gallon. And these come from various feedstocks, looking at poplar, woody biomass, corn, sugarcane. Now, the three on the right side of the plot in gray are the previous CO2 to synthetic aviation fuel example with three different assumption sets: a conservative, optimistic, and aggressive. And you can see those range from $2 up to $10 a gallon. And the core reason those range is we changed the assumption on the energy cost. And the cost of that energy is a primary driver on the overall cost of production because you require so much energy to be put into that CO2. And so when you go from an example case of 6.8 cents a kilowatt hour for, let's say, electricity, and you drop that to 2 cents a kilowatt hour, you're saving $4 to $5 a gallon on your fuel production. Now, using this example, we started with ethanol from a or CO2 from an ethanol biorefinery. That's at about $25 a ton as a range. And so we'll target that set point used here. If we change that from $25 a ton up to $250 a ton, so a 10x increase, thinking about a future state where maybe we could get to for direct air capture. Now you add on those red stars. That's the increase in cost just from changing the assumption of the CO2 cost. So you're talking about adding about $2 a gallon based on that change in the CO2 price coming into your facility. So key takeaways at the highest level: one, CO2 can be utilized to produce a whole variety of products. The ones being utilized today commercially are fertilizer, enhanced oil recovery, and food and beverage. There's a potential market size for CO2 utilization is on the order of $1 trillion, but we need to recognize that this is capital intensive, and thus it takes time to scale and penetrate into those markets. And then finally, the source of energy in CO2 has this significant impact on the production cost for fuels and chemicals specifically, and we need further R&D to help drive down those cost curves. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. And I apologize about my stepchild comment.
Not a worry.
I was just joking with that one. I really do find this to be a really cool aspect of the CCUS industry, utilizing CO2 and turning it from waste management problem into a commodity. A lot of startups out there with totally differing ideas on how to go about that, and it's just a really cool part of the industry to see. And like you said, trillion dollars of opportunity, which is super exciting in my opinion. So thanks, Josh. And our final presenter for today, talking about kind of the current policy status and maybe an outlook or two that kind of helps underpin how the industry can move forward. We have Christian Flynn from the Carbon Capture Coalition. Christian, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Alex. Hi, everyone. I'm Christian Flynn. I'm the Public Policy Manager at the Carbon Capture Coalition. And today I'm here to talk about mainly two things. Why should we engage in carbon management? And why should we do it now? And I think this is really relevant to all the presentations that you've heard today, talking about some of the background, the technicalities behind the technology. And so this is really digging into, the importance of it to the market as well as to our environment. And then what are the benefits of carbon management is kind of the second piece of that. And that has a lot to do with job creation as well as possible health benefits to be derived from carbon management technologies. So, why should we engage in carbon management? So, they're definitely a central part of a broader federal strategy to provide affordable, reliable domestic energy. And part of the reasoning behind that is, for example, with natural gas plants, if you have carbon retrofits, you can keep them running a lot longer and and in a much cleaner way. And so this helps extend plant life. It helps extend the useful life of the plant. And it also helps preserve jobs because those plants don't have to close and those jobs don't have to go offshore, for example. Technologies enable the preservation of facilities, as I mentioned, and they form the backbone of regional economies. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the investment numbers later on, but you'll see that they're pretty crucial to providing family sustaining wages in a lot of different regions of the country. Finally, then you have staying competitive on the global stage. And the real thought process here is that globally, the demand for less carbon intensive products is really growing. And so for the US to continue to remain competitive and a leader in that space, we need to continue innovating on carbon management technologies. And finally, while current policies and investments are not yet enough for the US to meet net zero by mid-century, um, we can keep domestic industries and energy production competitive without sacrificing economic growth. And that's really going to be a host of different policies that will enable that. So about 45Q. The Section 45Q tax credit is the foundational policy mechanism for the build out of the domestic carbon management industry and provides a per metric ton credit for the capture and storage or reuse of carbon oxides from natural gas and coal-fired power facilities, industrial facilities, and directly from the atmosphere. For tons of carbon sequestered, that's $85 per ton. And for utilization and enhanced oil recovery, it's around 130 if I'm not mistaken. But I'm happy to confirm those numbers for anybody who'd like them. And the reason 45Q is important is because it is the foundation for nationwide deployment of carbon management technologies. If you'll take a look at the map that's on screen, and I apologize if it's a little small, but you're going to be seeing that the number of announced domestic carbon management projects has really grown, especially since 2022, which is when the most recent enhancements to 45Q were announced. Originally, we were looking at around 140 projects in 2022, and that has now ballooned to over 270 announced and operational carbon management projects. So that's really good news, and it's indicative of 45Q's impact on the industry and its ability to attract investment. Furthering that point, 45Q continues to deliver appropriate market signals for projects to deploy across the nation. Up till now, we've seen a strong and estimated 77.5 billion in capital expenditures thanks to 45Q. And that's money that's already been invested by project developers. And then of note, of those 77.5 billion dollars, you're going to see that 18 billion are tied to Class 6 projects that are looking to permanently sequester CO2 in geological formations, as we discussed before. And the reason that's important is because that's CO2 that will no longer be in the atmosphere and that can be completely removed. You can also see on this figure over here on the right, the total estimated CapEx of announced carbon management projects through the end of 2024. Again, this is a lot of money, and 45Q is, almost not singularly, but primarily responsible for these numbers. So just a little bit of background of 45Q as of now. In 2008, 45Q was established. There's been a number of enhancements through the Future Act, guidance from Treasury in 2021, which was fundamental to really helping investors claim the credit. Then the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted, and that created some further enhancements and raised credit levels. And then in 2024, direct pay and transferability provisions were finally implemented by the IRS. Most recently, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act created credit value parity for end uses of captured carbon. So this basically means that utilization is now as incentivized as other end uses, as storages, because before the credit value for captured carbon that was then utilized to make other products was lower and therefore created a disincentive. So we managed to close that gap most recently. And so that was exciting. And the other point is that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act imposed foreign entities of concern restrictions on clean energy tax credits. And those are some new provisions that I'm happy to circulate any materials on if there are questions. This is just a further illustration of where the One Big Beautiful Bill Act left us. As I mentioned, it's $85 per metric ton for industry and powers for CO2 captured from industry and power, and $180 per metric ton for direct air capture or DAC. And now carbon reuse projects have achieved parity with storage in oil and gas fields. So now the credit is in a strong position, but we are, constantly working on what is the right level to incentivize business investment, and that's one of our many priorities under this Congress. So the next question is, why should we engage in carbon management now? So as I mentioned, there are over 270 announced and operating carbon management projects in the US, and we need to retain and further that growth moving forward. With the enhancements in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, as well as the historic enhancements, we're in a very strong policy framework position to further these investments and really add a lot of projects to the roster. And then finally, permitting reform is urgently needed when it comes to approving Class 6 wells. And the government and EPA have really been taking notice of that. And so our big point is that in this next Congress, we can put forth our slew of permitting principles as well as specific proposals for how we can improve permitting practices at EPA. And so all of these things are kind of combining at a good time for the industry to take advantage of that and be able to really grow exponentially. So diving a little bit more into the permitting reform and regulations issues, some examples of actions that the administration and Congress should take are issuing long-delayed rulemaking on additional safety regulations for CO2 pipelines. That would come from the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Administration, or PHMSA. Long-delayed guidance on storing CO2 on federal lands, as well as the Outer Continental Shelf. Both of those were authorized by the Inflation Reduction Act, but we have been waiting on guidance for them for now over 2 years. And then finally, Congress should establish an optional federal siting authority pathway for interstate CO2 pipelines to provide similar parity for all linear infrastructure systems. Basically, natural gas pipelines have a federal siting authority, and so the government can say, we need to build this path through this particular area of a state, and CO2 pipelines do not have that right now. So it's a patchwork of all of the states' regulations that the pipeline is going to go through. And so we see this as being potentially difficult and creating a disincentive to investment. And also, from a safety planning perspective, it's much easier if one entity has the siting authority for an interstate pipeline. Class 6 wells kind of further the point I was making before about permitting. There are over 240 well applications across 68 projects that are currently under review by EPA. That number has been slowly declining as EPA makes its way through the approval process, but it's still moving relatively slowly. if you'll see, there are only 3 projects in the prepare final decision phase, and only 11 final permits have been issued of the 240. And, previously this was higher. And so there's still definitely a way to go. But state primacy has really helped this, and that's basically giving states authority over their Class 6 well programs. And so far, North Dakota, Louisiana, Wyoming, West Virginia, and Arizona have primacy. And they are currently reviewing a total of 36 Class 6 project applications. And they've also issued a total of 11 permits. So what I think is interesting there is just seeing how state primacy can really alleviate some of the backlog at EPA, and how states are sometimes better positioned to make these approvals in a timely fashion. And in those cases, the coalition fully supports approval of state primacy. So what are the benefits of carbon management? So as I've touched on a little bit, we have job creation and retention, supplementing clean energy initiatives and emissions reduction efforts, attracting investment, and co-benefits in terms of better healthcare outcomes. This is especially true for communities that host emitting facilities, or, for example, a natural gas plant, as you'll see in the next slides. So first off, touching on carbon management as a job creator, the Carbon Capture Coalition is convened by the Great Plains Institute, which commissioned a study that looked at industrial facilities, power plants, and the build-out of associated CO2 transport infrastructure in 21 states across the Midwest. And what that showed us is that these jobs can support these regions can support an annual average of up to 68,000 project jobs and over 35,000 ongoing operational jobs over a 15-year period. And we got similar results in terms of the potential for job creation in the Mid-Atlantic region in a separate study. And you can also take a look at the graph on the right in a little bit more detail, but just to give you an idea, you're seeing the the range of low paying jobs and high paying jobs. And then if you look at the type of facility that they are located at, that can give you an idea of the types of regions that could benefit from these jobs, but also the types of labor that are needed at these facilities. Then the next piece of the puzzle is carbon management's role in reducing global emissions. So 2 major international organizations have agreed that carbon management is an essential component to reduce emissions to meet climate targets. If we are hoping to keep up with global energy demand, or global energy demand does not change drastically over the next decades. The idea is that we're going to need over 1,000 gigatons of CO2 stored by 2030 and 6,000 by 2050 in terms of carbon capture capacity, I apologize. And if we are hoping to meet net zero emissions. And then the amount of carbon removal needed by mid-century ranges from 5 billion metric tons to 16 billion metric tons per year, per the ICC. So again, there is a role for carbon management to play. It really supplements a lot of other emissions and clean energy initiatives, and enables those projects to be more effective in the long run. Co-benefits of carbon management. This is really related to the economic health benefit outcomes that I mentioned earlier, but the range of possible benefits is really high, from a low of 347 million to 1.8 billion. And that's just from outfitting 54 representative facilities with flue gas pretreatment and carbon capture equipment. And obviously it varies a little bit by each region, but saving even, the lowest end of the spectrum in terms of better healthcare outcomes is a huge amount of money. And so this is another consideration of why carbon management is so important, and why, especially right now, it's so important. Thank you all. Again, my name is Christian Flynn, and I'm the Public Policy Manager for the Carbon Capture Coalition.
Great. Thank you so much, Christian. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us and give us that overview of the policy landscape. We are close to time. if our panelists are okay with it, I would propose extending this until 2:10 Eastern. If you all have time, if you need to drop off, I totally understand. We had folks submit questions when they registered, as well as have had some questions come through the Q&A. So Emmanuel is going to moderate the Q&A portion, and I believe get started with the questions that came through our registration first, and then if there's any time left, we'll go into the ones that have been submitted during the webinar. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Emmanuel.
Okay. Hey, thanks so much, Alex. I'm gonna try to do my best to get a mix of the questions that have been asked, and we'll try to get these in quickly. So thanks again to all of the presenters for your remarks and in opening up this conversation. We do have a few things to follow up on. So there were a number of comments that have been made in descriptions around 45Q, and there were some questions that have come in for some specific details. So in particular, it was noted that 45Q requires a monitoring plan for Class 6 permits, and there was a question about whether or not that was also true for Class 2 permits related to enhanced oil recovery efforts. So, Kevin, I believe this question was for you in particular, but if anybody has insights that they'd like to share, welcome thoughts from all of the speakers.
Yeah, happy to answer the question. I might even be able to type in a little more detail here afterwards, but I think, to start, there's a reason why the requirements aren't prescriptive, and I think the person who asked the question actually kind of indicated that, because we talk about direct and indirect methods of monitoring, so we're not prescriptive on what exact technologies or exact methods to be used. And in an enhanced oil recovery project, you have the advantage of having many wells, injection and producing wells. You have field data for probably decades, and you have the ability to monitor not only your injection well operations, but also your production as well. So you have a distinct advantage in an enhanced oil recovery project just because of the way the field's designed and operating to be able to monitor your injection of CO2. That said, there is geophysical monitoring technologies that are being utilized to track that CO2. It helps with demonstrating permanence, which is where the question's going, but also it helps with ensuring operations in the manner of making sure that the CO2 that's injected is efficiently sweeping the reservoir. Is really what the operator is looking to do. They're trying to have a very efficient sweep, and so that the CO2 is coming in contact with the areas that haven't been produced within that rock or within that reservoir.
Well, Kevin, appreciate that explanation. I'm curious, just as a quick follow-up, if the enhanced oil recovery applications have any additional risks associated with leakage. And sorry if I'm not using the correct terminology, but I think in a dedicated well, right, there would be sort of less places of penetration and things like that. So I'm just wondering if there are other risks that might be motivating some of the questions that we see.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in my presentation, there's an advantage with an oil and gas reservoir because that there's that cap rock, that containment layer. That's actually the reason the oil is trapped in place, is because you have your naturally occurring containment within the geology. And so the leakage risk is less so, because otherwise that oil or gas would be leaking out of the reservoir, but it is contained. So you have a natural containment there. And so the focus then becomes on those wells. The wells are the primary risk for any sort of leakage, and that's why we make sure they're constructed properly. We evaluate wells that maybe were constructed before newer requirements or newer standards were developed, and we monitor in and around those wells. We basically focus on wellbore integrity to ensure that those wells aren't acting as a leakage pathway throughout the operational life of the project.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Appreciate that explanation. Thank you. We had another question that came in. So, Josh, in your presentation, you provided a quantification for the total CO2 utilization market. I think you valued it over $1 trillion potentially. There's a question about what that means in terms of the amount of annual CO2 that's produced within the US. So that $1 trillion valuation, does that represent all of the CO2? Is that just some measure of what we believe is technologically feasible or based on other constraints? Any clarification would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So if you look back at like one of the things I showed earlier, that McKinsey report, and you add up all the utilization pathways that they highlighted, it comes out to like 14.2 billion tons of CO2 based on their estimates. So that was what they thought the potential was for by 2030 for CCUS and CO2 utilization. Point source emissions in the US, off the top of my head, somebody will have to correct me if I'm wrong. Off the top of my head, I think are on the order of 6 billion tons of point source emissions. And total, that we think about globally is like on the order of like 36 to 40 billion tons of CO2 emitted globally. So it gives you an idea of kind of ballpark how much they thought was possible globally versus what we're doing in the US.
Okay, that is helpful as a differentiator. Definitely appreciate that. Christian, there was a comment for you as well, if you don't mind. There was a map that you had shown, and on that map it showed Class 6 well application locations, and I was curious whether or not that was publicly available information. Is that something that others can reference, especially those who are looking to better understand proximity, their own proximity to some of these potential sites?
Yeah, so we created that map in-house. And well, you guys are sharing out the slides after this, right? So with that in mind, the source for that information is typically the EPA Class 6 well tracker, and I put that in the Q&A for folks to view, I think in the answered column. But yeah, EPA has a Class 6 well tracker, and that's one of the more centralized ways anyway to see where the Class 6 wells are.
Okay, fantastic. Appreciate you sharing that, and I think we'll all look forward to referencing the slides as well when they come out by the end of the week. So thank you, Christian. There were a couple of questions that have come in regarding the current stance of the U.S. Department of Energy related to some of these technologies and efforts, some changes that have been made, and sort of what that looks like for the future. So I'm hoping we can get some perspectives from all of you in relation to this. The first was around the effects of the carbon safe program. Um, Given the current climate around DOE, as this was supported, folks are curious about next steps and continued progress for carbon capture program. So if anybody has any insights, uh, Kevin, I think this is something that you might be able to weigh in on as well. But we'd love to hear from anybody who has thoughts that they'd like to share.
And Manuel, can you help me with the specific question? What's the question?
Yeah, so I think folks are just curious in general. So, for instance, one question pointed to a project that had been funded by DOE but may potentially be revoked, and others have mentioned programs like Carbon Safe and its historical impacts. I guess there's a curiosity about DOE's position and support for uh, carbon capture projects and utilization projects moving forward. So, now I know nobody here, I believe, is authorized to speak explicitly on behalf of DOE, but it'd be interesting to understand perspectives, perceptions, or thoughts about the future of the industry and the impact of DOE in the changing landscape.
Well, I'll do my best to answer the question. I honestly think the answer is we still have to wait and see. I think, first of all, I think Christian kind of presented a little bit on it, but we saw the 45Q tax credit get extended, and so that certainly signals that this administration certainly supports CCUS when other tax credits did not. So that I think that was a good sign for CCUS that that there wasn't any drastic changes, that federal support is there. And I just like to maybe remind everyone in the audience that the DOE, we just recently had the final confirmation of our Assistant Secretary of Fossil Energy, which oversees the carbon safe programs and the CCUS portfolio. And so he's just getting into place. Actually, maybe now it's been a week or maybe a little longer. And so again, I think it's a wait and see to kind of how, what DOE is going to do moving forward in relation to that CCUS portfolio. But I can say that there is, I think it's been clear that there's support for coal, support for fossil energy, and support for utilizing that CO2 to recover oil and continue to build on the existing CO2 enhanced oil recovery projects that we have in this country that we've been leading worldwide in developing carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery projects. And there's more opportunity there to expand our existing opportunities across the nation.
Absolutely, Kevin. Appreciate those insights, and thank you again for the reminder. Christian's earlier note related to the expansion of 45Q and what that means for the utilization industry as a result of the One Big Beautiful Bill. So thank you, Josh. I was wondering if you had any insights from maybe the NREL perspective or from the National Lab point of view.
I think at this point that's not something I should comment on.
Okay, understand completely. Respect that, and definitely appreciate that as well. There were a few more questions that have come in, and one was related to the real cost of capture. And looks like in the comments there was an attempt to put sort of a dollar per megaton price on capture activities. I was curious if folks have any insights about what that real cost looks like.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. Cost of capture, the short answer is that it varies a lot. So, for depending on the emitting facility in question, right? So, for concentrated industrial sources, for like natural gas processing, it's on the lower end of the spectrum, probably around $15, but it could be up to 35 depending on how the plant is structured. And then for power plants and electricity production, you're looking at more like a range of $50 to $120 per metric ton. DAC is definitely the most expensive, and again, that's direct air capture, but it's mostly because the technology is a lot newer and is still being tested in a lot of cases. So that range is much higher. It's something, like between $300 and $800 per metric ton. But that variability is really indicative of just where the technology is at, that it's like fairly new. So I would say like that's more or less where we're at today, but it's probably going to change fairly quickly within the next few years.
Okay, now that's super helpful. And I think we have about 2 minutes left. I'll try to just sneak in one more question. There was a question that came in the registration about sort of the actual versus imagined risks related to these technologies. And I know in an earlier presentation, it was noted that although there, have been CO2 pipeline failures, there have been no fatalities, and the track record is actually, quite good related to CO2 transportation. So I was wondering if anybody would want to speak just a bit about what we've seen. There were many actual projects with decades of experience that have been highlighted in the presentation. So what can be said about what we actually know about the risks associated with these technologies?
Yeah, I'm happy to start it out there. I mean, as I mentioned, we have a really good track record in terms of transporting and injecting CO2. Again, it's not without risk, but those risks are accounted for in the projects. I actually believe a lot of the risks are accounted for just in the regulatory framework to get permitted and to operate and to report. And so there's risk mitigation in the regulation alone. And then the technologies are there to monitor the CO2. Again, I talked about, in order to most efficiently transport and inject CO2 and store it, we put it under pressure and temperature, and have it be in that dense phase or that supercritical state. That allows us to monitor pressure when we transport CO2, and so that's a great tool for making sure that the pipelines have integrity. And same thing with the injection wells. We're injecting at pressure. We're able to monitor in and around the injection well itself to make sure that it maintains that integrity. And that's again, as I mentioned, we understand that those are our risks, and so we focus on proper construction, proper engineering, proper materials, and then monitoring to maintain integrity of those of both the pipeline and the wells. So this is something, again, we've been doing for over 50 years with CO2, and we've progressed and continually improved our understanding of how to ensure that we're doing it safely.
Yeah, I can add just one thing to that, which is again, turning, as Kevin mentioned, like we are aware that there is some degree of risk involved with these pipelines with any linear infrastructure system, really. But as I mentioned previously, PHMSA, or the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, um, is working on updated safety regulations for CO2 pipelines and has issued two ANPRMs to that effect. There's one that's related to updating repair criteria specifically, and then another one that is related to more general updates to PHMSA's safety regulations and the way that they approach pipeline safety and integrity. So really, I think while the risks are, characterized by the risk of CO2 as a chemical, there are a lot of mechanisms already in place and that are looking to be strengthened over probably the next year. And so I'd say that is just another consideration for folks to keep in mind. And also, CO2 pipelines do have the best track record of any other linear infrastructure system, and that's worth noting. And part of that is because of the strong regulatory framework, as well as, the construction and the integrity of the projects themselves.
Yeah, thank you for those insights, and great to hear about those anticipated changes and to know that things are evolving over time in response to this growing industry. There is one more question that was asked a few times that, as long as Alex isn't cutting me off, I'm going to sneak in here. And this was just related to changing EPA reporting regulations around greenhouse gases and the potential that that could have on 45Q, the tax credit. So if anybody has any insights they'd like to share, there are folks curious to know how those potential EPA changes could impact eligibility for the tax credit.
I can start. Um, there's not a ton that I can say that hasn't already been said publicly, but really, the gist of it is Subpart RR is very, very important to the industry, especially because of its intrinsic link with 45Q. Basically, in order to claim 45Q, you have a number of monitoring, verification, and reporting requirements established under Subpart RR. And by statute, that is required reporting to EPA in order to claim 45Q. And so from our perspective, that's one of the biggest risks associated with this with this proposed rule of reconsidering the GHGRP. And, our general position, and we said this in our testimony to the EPA as well, is that eliminating the program just inserts a lot of uncertainty into a process that has been agreed upon by industry. Industry was heavily involved in the adoption of monitoring and reporting requirements under Subpart RR into the updated regulations related to claiming 45Q. And so to go now and change that system really jeopardizes, the 18 billion in investment that I mentioned previously, but more largely speaking, the full 77.5 billion of the industry, as investors won't have the certainty that 45Q can be secured by the project.
Yeah, no, great points. I think the a regulatory environment and tax policy definitely help to set the stability and the interpretation of market dynamics. And so we'll all have our eyes and our ears open moving forward as the environment continues to be dynamic. I want to say thank you again for our presenters. Thank you for sticking around for this Q&A and even staying with us a few extra minutes. And thank you also for the folks who have asked questions, both in the registration and in the Q&A. Alex, I'll turn it back over to you now.
Great. Thanks, Emmanuel. Really appreciate you coming in to moderate the Q&A, and as well as our presenters for a great set of presentations. Bunch of questions came in, so folks were pretty engaged on that. That's always a great sign. Just want to highlight a couple of events that we have coming up, as well as some resources. If you're in the DC area or will be in the DC area, October 23rd, we have our Energy Tech Connect and networking reception. So feel free to join us for that. We are also planning a startup spotlight series looking at startups in the clean fossil energy space. Look for that to happen late October, early November timeframe. Then we'll have the next two webinars in this series looking at the CO2 commute, pipeline and transport, which we're planning for mid-November, and then CO2 storage, safe and sound underground, planned for early December. So keep an eye out for those announcements. And then I just finally want to give a quick highlight to our stakeholder resources that you can find on USEA's website if you'd like to learn more about CCUS. This is a really comprehensive list of a bunch of different resources that folks can look into and learn more about CCUS. It is living, so if you'd like to add to it, please let us know. With that, thank you everyone for your patience, for sticking with us, and we hope to see you next time. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.